All right, so the one other thing I want to talk about in this section fairly quickly is why we use cryptography, or why we use hashes for storing passwords. So I think the Zybook does a pretty good job of explaining all of this, but I want to basically mention one concept here. So as we looked at up here in this example, okay, we actually had the username and password stored right here in the code. And we had the real password stored here, not a hashed password. And the problem with this, okay, was storing a real password either here in the code or even in a database. Even if we were storing this information in a database and searching the database to check to see if the password was Open Sesame. The problem with that, well, there's two problems. One is the one that most people are aware of, and that's that if somebody actually, somebody from an outside attacker, or somebody basically got into the system and recovered all of the passwords that are stored in the database or even stored in the code here, okay, they could just look at that and instantaneously say, I know the password, so now I can log in. Okay, it's very, very easy. So that's one situation. But the other one is that the people working here at the company now know your password. So if these passwords are stored in a database or stored in the code, just like this, okay, anybody who works at the company can just look right at the password and know exactly what it is. And now they can go home and they can log in. So if this is a bank, for example, they could go home and they could say, oh, Brad Smith's password is Open Sesame. Hey, when I get home tonight, I'm going to go log in as Brad Smith in Open Sesame, and I'm going to, pay a bunch of bills or whatever. Okay, so you usually think of the hackers from the outside and not wanting them to get a hold of these passwords, but you also just need to realize that the people who work for the company, even themselves, okay, it wouldn't be, hopefully they're all honest and would never do this, but you just never know. And so we don't want to store passwords in their exact form, in their plain text version. And that's what all of the rest of this section is all about. And it's that basically we take any password that's sent into an application and we hash it through using one of these hash functions. There's several of them, so that the password gets stored like this. And the key, or the important part about this is there's no way for somebody to be given this information and go back and figure out what the original password was. These hash functions are called one-way hashes. They only go one way. They take this information and encrypt it to become this version, but there's no way to take this version and decrypt it to go back to this version. Okay? So that's the important thing. So by storing the passwords in this form, even if a hacker hacked in and looked at this password, they couldn't at least easily get back to the original version. Okay, well, they couldn't directly get back to the original version. Or a person who works at the company, if they look into a database, if they have access to a database and they say, here's Brad Smith's password. Okay, they're not going to see this, they're going to see this. And there's no way for them to directly go back to the original password so they can go log into the system and do whatever they want to do as Brad Smith. Okay, so that's the whole concept here, and there's a lot more details in here, including using salts. It's introduced somewhere down here, okay, and talking about how people still can get your password to a certain extent by doing these types of attacks. And they don't do it by actually taking this and decrypting it back to this. They just try all passwords until they eventually get a password that actually hashes to this password, and then they know what your original password was. But anyway, the rest of this section I think does a pretty good job of explaining how the rest of this works. I just wanted to point out a few details about why this is important. And then for those of you who are, if you decide on your actual project that you're going to need some form of user authentication where you have to store people's passwords, you need to do this. Okay, you need to read this a little more closely and learn about how you can store the passwords in your database in this hashed form using a salt.